What if the most terrifying ruler of the ancient world was not a general, not a tyrant, not even a prophet of war, but a woman whose power came from something no empire could understand? That question haunted every historian who dared to open the sealed archives describing the rise of the Crimson Queen, a figure so feared that entire provinces whispered her name only at night. And yet, the truth about her ascent does not begin with conquest or bloodshed. It begins with a single, disturbing event that no one could explain. Before she was the Crimson Queen, she was a political hostage sent to the capital as a symbol of peace. A young noblewoman surrounded by enemies who smiled at her with their mouths while sharpening knives behind her back. But something happened on the night of her arrival. Something witnessed by a single guard who later vanished from all imperial records. He claimed that as she stepped into the throne hall, every torch flickered at once, dimming as if the flames themselves were bowing. When he looked at her face, he felt a pressure behind his eyes, a quiet command that was not spoken but planted in his mind, like a seed. And from that moment on, he obeyed her without question. This was the first documented sign of her influence, though scholars still argue whether it was sorcery, psychological mastery, or something far more ancient. What no one disputes is that she rose through the court with unnatural speed. Ministers who opposed her suddenly changed. Allegiance. Generals who once denied her authority swore loyalty after a single private audience. Even the emperor himself grew strangely dependent on her counsel, describing her in his journals as the only person who could make the empire breathe. But behind the scenes, rumors spread like smoke. Servants swore she walked without sound. Advisors claimed her presence made rooms colder, as if she carried winter beneath her skin. And more unsettling than all of that were the disappearances. 3 noble rivals who confronted her publicly were never seen again. Their estates were seized, their families silenced, their names erased from official documents. The empire pretended they had never existed, but the people knew better. They whispered that the Crimson Queen had taken them for a purpose, a ritual, a demonstration of power meant to warn anyone who doubted her. Here is where the story becomes impossible to ignore. Every great ruler in history required armies, alliances, or wealth. She required none of that. She used fear, presence, and something deeper, something that made even the bravest commanders look away when her eyes met theirs. You can almost feel the tension of those early years, the sense that everyone around her understood a storm was forming, but no one dared to speak of it aloud. Because acknowledging her power meant admitting they were already trapped inside it. And as we go deeper into her story, you will see that what she did to her captured enemies was not born from madness. It was born from strategy, ritual, and a chilling philosophy about human obedience. But before we reach that moment, I want to know something from you. Have you ever sensed when someone holds power far beyond what they show? Leave a comment sharing your impression, hit the like button if this opening already challenged your expectations, and check if you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next, because the next piece of this story pushes us into the shadows she controlled so effortlessly. The deeper you move into the hidden archives, the clearer it becomes that the Crimson Queen never relied on brute force. Her true dominance emerged the moment her enemies fell into her hands, because captivity under her rule was not merely punishment, it was transformation. Those who challenged her authority learned too late that defeat on the battlefield was only the beginning. The first captured enemy recorded in imperial documents was a regional warlord known for burning border towns and executing envoys. When he was brought before her, still chained and bleeding, witnesses reported an atmosphere so tense that even armed guards stepped backward. She approached him slowly, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling: curiosity. The warlord spat at her feet, expecting retaliation. Instead, she placed a single hand on his face, and everyone watching swore his expression changed instantly, as if a sudden understanding drained the defiance out of him. He did not scream. He did not beg. He simply lowered his head, trembling, whispering something no scribe could fully record. Days later, he vanished inside the forbidden wing of the palace, a place sealed from the rest of the empire. Those who worked near that corridor claimed the air felt heavier, carrying a metallic scent that clung to their clothes long after they were dismissed. Scholars later uncovered fragments of testimony from palace physicians describing crimson markings on the walls, patterns so intricate they resembled a language rather than stains left by violence. But the warlord was not alone. Over the next months, a series of captured rebels, traitors, and rival nobles were taken alive at her command. She insisted on their survival, even when generals advised immediate execution. Witnesses noticed a pattern. Every prisoner was brought into her presence at dusk, when the palace torches shifted into deeper shades of red. The rituals always began with silence, the kind that forces a person to confront their own thoughts until fear fills the empty spaces. Then she would speak, not loudly, but in a tone that compelled attention, weaving words that felt like threads tightening around the mind. Some prisoners emerged days later, but they were not the same. They spoke softly, avoided sunlight, and refused to meet anyone's eyes. They carried themselves like shadows imprinted with her will, and when asked what had happened inside those rooms, they reacted with the same unsettling response, a mixture of awe and terror. Others never returned at all, though their names quietly disappeared from official records, erased as if they had never stood against her. And the empire accepted this without protest, because acknowledging the truth meant facing the possibility that her methods were beyond human understanding. The most disturbing detail, found in a confiscated journal of an imperial advisor, hinted that the rituals were not mere intimidation. They were structured, intentional, rooted in an ancient tradition that predated the empire by centuries. Symbols associated with forgotten cults of obedience were found carved into stone slabs near the restricted chambers. The advisor wrote that the queen possessed knowledge no one else in the empire could access, knowledge designed to break the boundaries of loyalty and reshape the human will itself. And as these transformations multiplied, something began to change at the highest levels of the court. Her influence grew not only through fear, but through the eerie effectiveness of the individuals she sent back into the world, individuals who obeyed with absolute precision. Their former identities dissolved into a deeper allegiance that no rival could explain. This was the moment when whispers of her rituals spread beyond the palace, reaching generals, ministers, and eventually the emperor himself, who realized too late that her power did not merely bend enemies. It redefined them in ways that left the entire empire trapped between fascination and dread, pushing us closer to understanding the true nature of the forces she commanded. Inside the Crimson Queen's palace, there was a room no ordinary visitor ever described in full detail. Known only as the Red Chamber, it was a place where every captured enemy was taken to confront the true scale of her dominion. The walls were painted in deep crimson, absorbing light and reflecting shadows in ways that unsettled even seasoned soldiers. But the color was only the beginning. Observers, few and terrified, noted subtle vibrations in the floorboards, faint hums that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the palace itself. Many later claimed they felt disoriented within minutes, as if time itself had slowed. When a prisoner entered the Red Chamber, they were stripped of every weapon, every article of status, every token of identity. Even the guards, stationed at precise intervals, were silent, their eyes wide, almost reverent. The queen herself would not immediately appear. Instead, the room enforced a psychological tension that left the captives exposed to their own fears. The silence was punctuated by a single candle, its flame flickering unnaturally, casting elongated forms across the walls. In this environment, the mind began to betray itself. The bravest warriors confessed in secret memoirs that their thoughts raced uncontrollably, doubt and paranoia eating through resolve. After this initial period, the Crimson Queen entered, but never with overt aggression. She spoke with calm precision, describing events and decisions in ways that forced prisoners to question every action they had ever taken. She would recount minute details of their campaigns, battles, even private betrayals, exposing weaknesses they thought hidden. Each revelation was timed, measured, and designed to make the subject feel powerless while simultaneously awake to her insight. Every movement, every pause, in her speech, was a methodical probe into their psyche, testing the elasticity of fear, obedience, and despair. One account, preserved in fragments of a guard's journal, tells of a general who had opposed her early in her rise. Within hours in the Red Chamber, he experienced a breakdown so complete that he begged for instructions instead of fighting. The Queen, however, allowed him only partial guidance, forcing him to make choices that led to further humiliation and dependency. By the second day, the prisoner's concept of strategy, loyalty, and personal honor had been inverted, making him an instrument of her will even when returned to the battlefield. The methods she used were not random acts of cruelty. They were psychological engineering, honed through years of observation, trial, and ritual. The Red Chamber was designed to simulate isolation, uncertainty, and total scrutiny. Guards and servants were selected for their subtlety, their ability to reinforce fear without overt threat. The air itself seemed orchestrated. Scents, temperature, and lighting all contributed to an environment where the prisoner's mind became the weapon. And the most terrifying part was that each session ended not with death, but with the promise of survival, ensuring the captives would carry the memory of their submission forever, reshaping their behavior, their alliances, and their loyalty. By the time the prisoner left, if they left at all, they were no longer the person who had entered. Every action had been catalogued, every weakness memorized. Some reported that, after leaving, they experienced compulsive obedience, unable to act without consulting the Queen's judgment, as though a part of their mind had been claimed. Those who resisted were never seen again, their erasure serving as both a warning and a lesson. In this way, the Crimson Queen's power did not rely on armies or swords. It relied on mastery of the human mind, bending it with precision until the empire itself became a theater of fear and unspoken devotion, inching ever closer to her ultimate designs. What the Crimson Queen inherited was not gold, not armies, not titles, but a secret older than the empire itself. Buried in the vaults of her ancestors, hidden beneath layers of ritual and blood, were manuscripts describing a discipline so precise, so psychologically exacting, that it could bend even the most resolute minds. Known among her inner circle only as the Crimson Codex, it contained instructions on influence, manipulation, and domination that blurred the line between fear and reverence. Scholars who later stumbled upon fragments of the text described it as part psychological treatise, part ceremonial guide, and part ritualized cruelty. The Queen's rise was intertwined with her mastery of these techniques. She did not merely learn to punish, she learned to make people obey before a command was even given. Captured enemies were exposed to intricate simulations, subtle, sensory manipulations and rituals that disoriented perception, breaking the mind's resistance. The Red Chamber, though terrifying on its own, was merely the first stage in a larger framework outlined in the Codex. These rituals were designed to create a loop of dependency, where prisoners and subjects began to seek her approval, even when it brought them closer to destruction. One account details a regional commander brought to her palace for questioning. He entered the crimson-lit corridors, confident, defiant. Within hours, he was subjected to a series of exercises derived from the Codex. forced isolation, exposure to disorienting sounds and scents, and an unrelenting sequence of choices designed to make him doubt his own judgment. By the time the queen appeared, he was already pliable. His fear transformed into anticipatory submission. Each step she took, each word she spoke, built on the precise psychological destabilization that had already begun. It was mastery of timing, environment, and expectation, calibrated to perfection. But her power extended beyond prisoners. Advisors, generals, and even distant rulers found themselves unconsciously complying with her desires. Messages sent from provinces arrived rewritten, laws passed without challenge, and armies reorganized without orders directly from the emperor. Some whispered that her knowledge of human behavior bordered on supernatural. Others insisted it was the meticulous application of the codex. Every move was a demonstration that understanding the human mind could be more lethal than the sharpest blade. The most disturbing element of this ancestral wisdom was its ability to erase resistance while leaving individuals alive. The codex did not demand execution. It demanded transformation. By bending perception and expectation, the Crimson Queen created obedient instruments from defiant spirits. Entire networks of spies, soldiers, and courtiers were shaped by these rituals, acting as extensions of her will without ever stepping into the chamber themselves. They carried the lessons forward, reinforcing the empire's hierarchy while spreading fear in the most insidious way. It is here, in the inheritance of the codex and the disciplined application of its rituals, that the full scope of her dominance becomes clear. She did not conquer by armies alone. She conquered minds, reshaping loyalty, obedience, and even thought itself. Every enemy, every captive, every whisper in the court fed into a system designed to maintain her supremacy. Now, I want to know from you. Could you imagine facing a ruler whose control over your mind was more dangerous than any weapon? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What would you do in such a situation? The significance of understanding this secret and how it shaped the empire cannot be overstated. And remember to stay engaged, because what she did next would push the boundaries of fear and obedience to unprecedented extremes. The Crimson Queens. Genius lay not just in the rituals themselves, but in what came after. Once a prisoner or rival had been broken through the Red Chamber or guided by the Codex's methods, they were not discarded. Instead, they were transformed into living instruments, subtle extensions of her control throughout the empire. Each man, woman, or minor noble who survived the initial tests became an agent without loyalty to anything but her will. They carried out tasks with precision, acting as conduits of fear and obedience in places she could not personally reach. Historians later discovered accounts of generals who returned from her palace no longer commanding armies in the traditional sense. Instead, they moved like shadows of her strategy, executing campaigns that aligned with her designs without consultation. One such general, a man renowned for his defiance in the northern provinces, reportedly used tactics that seemed independent, but each decision subtly reinforced the queen's overarching plans. The people who witnessed these maneuvers often remarked on the almost unnatural coordination between disparate regions, as if a single mind was guiding them all. Prisoners sent back to their territories were carefully monitored. Their families were often subtly threatened or incentivized, creating networks of obedience rooted in both fear and survival instinct. A merchant caught resisting the queen's orders might find his shipment mysteriously delayed, his contracts voided, while the former, captive, would act as an unseen intermediary, ensuring compliance. Every interaction reinforced the sense that resistance was not only futile but invisible to the human eye, as if the queen's power had penetrated every corner of daily life. The transformation was not physical alone. It was psychological, designed to make the prisoner internalize the queen's dominance. Reports from secret correspondence indicate that many of these instruments of control began to self-police. They anticipated her, desires before commands were issued, executing strategies in ways that furthered her empire while masking the mechanisms of control from outsiders. In essence, she weaponized loyalty itself. Even in courts far from the capital, rumors circulated of officials who suddenly shifted allegiance after unexplained episodes of disorientation or dreams that seemed to guide their decisions. Chroniclers noted that these shifts were always in line with the Queen's political interests. Some suggested that the Red Chamber had a lasting effect, imprinting patterns of thought and behavior that persisted long after individuals returned home. Others believed she had discovered a method to manipulate memory and perception, creating a network of compliant actors who could not conceive of betrayal without overwhelming cognitive dissonance. What makes this even more disturbing is the efficiency. By converting enemies into instruments of control rather than destroying them, she multiplied her power exponentially. One captive could influence dozens, even hundreds, carrying forward her will while eliminating the risk of rebellion through fear alone. The empire did not require endless enforcement because the prisoners themselves became the enforcers, executing her strategies silently, invisibly, but with devastating effectiveness. This system of transformation ensured that the Crimson Queen's influence extended far beyond her physical presence. Entire provinces were aligned with her vision, without her needing to dispatch troops or issue visible commands. The empire became a living extension of her psychological mastery, an intricate web where fear, obedience, and subtle manipulation maintained order more reliably than any army ever could. Each former captive, each manipulated officer, became a node in a network that made her dominance appear effortless and inevitable, a testament to the horrifying sophistication of her rule. In the shadowed corridors of the Crimson Queen's palace, there existed a form of execution unlike any chronicled in the Empire's histories. It was called the Silent Judgment. Though that name reached only whispers among the palace staff, no trumpets announced the condemned, no crowds gathered, there was no spectacle to witness, and yet the mere knowledge that it could occur struck terror into the hearts of generals, courtiers, and even ministers in the farthest provinces. This was a punishment designed not for public display, but for the total eradication of hope, and it worked with terrifying precision. Captives selected for the Silent Judgment were taken to a secluded chamber far beneath the palace, a place where light and sound barely penetrated. Witnesses, few who survived to tell the tale, described a room where the very air seemed to press against the lungs, and shadows moved as if alive. The condemned were not bound, not forced into submission through chains or whips. Instead, they were subjected to an environment, meticulously engineered to strip away perception, to dissolve identity, to make them question every thought and memory. Hours stretched into days, days into nights, though no sun marked the passage of time. Hunger, fatigue, and isolation were compounded by the psychological precision the Queen had perfected. When the Crimson Queen entered, she did not wield a sword or pronounce a sentence. Her power was invisible. She would speak softly, almost conversationally, recounting details of the prisoner's failures, victories, and hidden ambitions, dissecting choices as if reading an open book of the mind. Each word was a scalpel, cutting away resistance, exposing the self to her omnipresent gaze. A military strategist, once undefeated in battle, reportedly emerged hours later compliant, trembling, yet physically unharmed. Another noblewoman, whose defiance had been legendary, returned with an expression hollowed of identity, her loyalty now an extension of the Queen's will. The Empire itself trembled at the knowledge of this execution method because no one could predict when it would be used or who would be chosen next. The uncertainty was part of the punishment, the fear of silence more devastating than the certainty of death. Even whispers in distant provinces carried the weight of the Silent Judgment, compelling obedience without a single sword drawn. It became the invisible backbone of her empire, a psychological dominion that extended across mountains, rivers, and city walls. Perhaps the most chilling accounts describe prisoners who were not only returned, but integrated back into positions of power. They carried with them the mark of the experience, subtle but irreversible. They became silent enforcers, conduits of her influence, and living examples of what happened when resistance met the full scope of her mastery. The silent judgment was more than a punishment. It was a tool for reshaping minds, erasing doubt, and reinforcing the perception that the Crimson Queen's authority was omnipresent, inevitable, and inescapable. No chronicler dared record the precise mechanisms, yet fragments of correspondence hint at rituals, sensory deprivation, and carefully calculated sequences designed to dismantle cognitive resistance. Those who survived never spoke openly, their stories fragmented into allegories and warnings. And the rest of the empire, though unaware of the specifics, carried the weight of fear in every decree, every march, every whispered decision. This unseen execution became the Queen's most potent weapon, cementing her control not through spectacle, but through the haunting certainty that the unseen could strike at any moment, and that defiance would always carry consequences far beyond comprehension. In the inner chambers of the Crimson Queen's palace, a different kind of allegiance thrived. Her personal attendants were not mere servants. They were women bound by a pact older than the empire itself, a covenant whispered in secrecy and steeped in ritual. These women, drawn from noble families, distant provinces, and even former rivals, pledged themselves not just to serve, but to embody the Queen's will, becoming both shield and instrument of her power. The rules of this pact were as precise as the Queen's psychological strategies. Obedience demanded in silence, loyalty enforced through fear, and secrets carried as if they were sacred. The initiation into the Queen's inner circle was deliberately disorienting. New, recruits were led through labyrinthine corridors, past rooms echoing with the memories of captured enemies, and into chambers bathed in crimson light. There, a ritual awaited them, a ceremony of submission and affirmation, combining elements of oath-taking, symbolic gestures, and whispered incantations that bound mind and body. Those who hesitated faced more than reprimand. They were confronted with the subtle but terrifying display of what awaited those who broke trust. A former general, brought to this chamber as a tribute to her mastery, reportedly witnessed a noblewoman vanish silently for defiance, her absence a constant reminder that loyalty came at a price. Once bound by the pact, these women became extensions of the Queen's strategy. They moved through the palace, and even the broader empire, executing tasks that seemed mundane on the surface, delivering messages, observing prisoners, maintaining order. But each action subtly reinforced her dominion. Their presence alone was enough to manipulate perception. The way they glanced, paused, or aligned themselves in rooms instilled a sense of surveillance and control, ensuring that the people around them adjusted behavior without a single word spoken. Even seasoned advisors admitted that the attendants' quiet authority often eclipsed that of generals and ministers. The most unsettling aspect of the pact was its psychological depth. The attendants were trained to internalize the Queen's intent to the point that they anticipated commands before they were given, acting as autonomous agents of influence. And yet this obedience was not entirely enforced by fear. It was reinforced by an intricate system of reward and subtle acknowledgement. The Queen recognized and manipulated emotions, loyalty, and desire with such precision that devotion became indistinguishable from survival instinct. Some attendants reported experiencing visions or dreams that guided them toward decisions in line with her will, leaving them convinced that disobedience was impossible, not merely dangerous, but unthinkable. Historians later noted that these women were crucial to her empire's stability. They were the carriers of her secret strategies, the keepers of her psychological methods, and, in many ways, the guardians of the Red Chamber's legacy. Without them, the mechanisms of fear, obedience, and transformation could not have extended beyond the palace walls. The empire's bureaucracy and military might were important, yes, but it was these silent, disciplined women who ensured that her influence permeated every province, every court, and every mind. Now, consider the weight of such loyalty. Could a ruler truly bend the empire through a network of individuals whose devotion was absolute, precise, and in many ways, self-enforcing? Leave a comment below reflecting on this pact, and share your thoughts on what it would be like to serve in such a circle. Understanding their role is essential to grasp the full scope of the Crimson Queen's power, and your perspective adds to the discussion of how influence, fear, and obedience shaped history in ways that records alone cannot capture. Not all the empire bowed silently to the Crimson Queen. Hidden among the provinces, whispers of rebellion began to stir, carried by nobles who refused to accept a ruler whose power seemed absolute, whose influence extended into the mind itself. These conspirators were careful, moving like shadows through the court and countryside, coordinating their plans in secrecy. Letters were burned immediately after reading, secret meetings held in abandoned estates, and coded messages sent through networks of merchants and travelers. Yet, no plan, however intricate, could fully account for the Queen's foresight. The first sign of resistance that reached the palace was subtle. A governor failed to deliver his tribute on the appointed day, claiming delays that seemed innocuous, but carried a hidden defiance. The Crimson Queen responded not with armies, but with observation. She sent her attendants to shadow him, monitor his communications, and, most disturbingly, to subtly manipulate his household. Within days, servants loyal to the Queen had infiltrated his residence, steering conversations, influencing decisions, and subtly isolating key allies. The governor, who believed he was orchestrating a rebellion, found his plans unraveling without knowing why. Those caught in these conspiracies faced fates far worse than execution. The Queen understood that death alone could inspire martyrdom, resistance, and stories that outlived her. Instead, she used her knowledge of the human mind to disassemble her enemies systematically. Captured conspirators were subjected to what later scholars called the Red Discipline, a combination of isolation, psychological manipulation, and sensory distortion designed to make them question every memory, every loyalty, every belief. Over weeks, months even, their perception of reality was bent, reshaped, until the very thought of defiance seemed impossible. Witnesses recorded chilling details. A former noble, once brash and outspoken, was returned to his province convinced he had been recruited by the Queen herself to suppress his own allies. Another, a military strategist, began issuing orders that undermined his own faction without realizing he was doing so. The empire was watching its most defiant subjects effectively destroy themselves, all guided by invisible hands trained by the Queen's rituals. Those who tried to flee or resist again disappeared, their absence leaving a void in the records, a warning to others. Even in distant provinces, stories spread of sudden, inexplicable obedience. Villages that had resisted taxation or recruitment now complied without confrontation. Merchants reported that rebellious towns reorganized their defenses not according to local strategy, but in ways that aligned with imperial interests. And the most unsettling detail was that many of these actions were carried out without the Queen's direct command, the prisoners and conspirators having internalized her authority so completely that they acted autonomously, yet entirely in service of her design. The lesson of the failed rebellion became a grim tale whispered across the empire. Resistance was possible, but only on the surface. Below, in the hidden currents of influence, the Crimson Queen's reach was absolute. Her intelligence, her psychological mastery, and the network of transformed prisoners ensured that any attempt to oppose her was not merely crushed, it was redirected, neutralized, and turned into a tool for maintaining her dominance. And those who survived the Red discipline emerged changed, forever bound to the empire. Instruments of obedience that would serve as living proof of what happens when defiance meets the Queen's calculated control. The Crimson Queen's reign did not end with her presence in the throne room. It extended far beyond her lifetime, etched into the very structures of the empire she mastered. The rituals, psychological manipulations, and networks of loyal agents she established became the foundation of imperial governance, ensuring her influence persisted long after she ceased to walk among her subjects. Ministers and generals who had once been her captives continued to shape policy with an almost mechanical precision, their obedience internalized to the point where questioning a directive, even a subtle suggestion, was inconceivable. The empire itself became an extension of her mind. Her methods were studied and codified in secret, preserved in hidden chambers and in the memories of those who had survived her inner circle. Future rulers, seeking to understand the mechanisms of control that allowed her to consolidate power so efficiently, discovered a blueprint for dominance that combined ritual, fear, and the strategic use of obedience. Those who had been trained under her guidance, or forced into her Red chamber, became instructors in their own right, teaching lessons in psychological mastery and the orchestration of loyalty. In this way, her legacy was not a simple lineage of blood or title, but a pervasive and insidious architecture of influence that shaped the empire's political landscape for decades. Even decades later, reports from provincial governors reveal echoes of her strategies. Officials who had never seen the Queen in person carried out decrees with precision, anticipating the consequences of disobedience in a system that had internalized her methods of fear and persuasion. Military campaigns were executed with remarkable efficiency, often without direct orders, reflecting the indirect control she had woven into the minds of her former captives. Courts and councils operated under a shadow of influence so complete that decisions appeared spontaneous but were subtly orchestrated by the psychological frameworks she had instilled. Historians who later examined her reign noticed a pattern. Regions once rebellious now operated under highly structured compliance, their leaders unaware that the mechanisms enforcing obedience had roots in her clandestine methods. The empire's bureaucracy, already formidable, became a web of subtle control, each node of influence shaped by the training and transformation of individuals who had experienced the full scope of the Crimson Queen's psychological techniques. Her rituals had not only broken enemies, they had created instruments of governance, reinforcing imperial authority without the need for overt coercion. What makes her legacy particularly chilling is that it blurred the line between voluntary loyalty and conditioned compliance. The empire flourished, yet its stability was underpinned by networks of people who had been molded through fear, ritual, and strategic manipulation. The policies enacted under her guidance, or through those she had trained, ensured that resistance was rare, and when it appeared, it was swiftly neutralized, often by the very individuals who had once plotted against her. In essence, she had engineered a system where rebellion became inconceivable, not through armies alone, but through the silent, pervasive influence of her methods. As we examine the extent of her impact, one cannot ignore the ethical and human consequences. The empire's efficiency and cohesion came at the cost of countless minds reshaped, personalities altered, and lives forever defined by obedience. This is the lasting shadow of the Crimson Queen, a structure of power so deeply embedded that even the emperor himself became a node in her web, illustrating how one individual's mastery over fear, ritual, and psychology can echo through generations, shaping history in ways visible only to those who know where to look. The Crimson Queen vanished as suddenly as she had risen, leaving behind a palace echoing with whispers, corridors filled with shadows, and an empire forever shaped by her methods. Official records claim she died quietly in her chambers, attended by a handful of loyal servants. But the truth hidden in forbidden archives suggests something far more deliberate. Secret correspondences, encoded in manuscripts locked away from public view for centuries, imply that she orchestrated her disappearance to ensure her influence could continue undisturbed, preserved in the minds of those she had trained and manipulated. Her absence was not weakness, it was strategy. These prohibited records reveal a meticulous plan. Before leaving the public eye, she had rewritten the imperial directives, encoded loyalty into surviving captives, and seated the empire with her inner circle in positions of subtle authority. Even the emperor's closest advisors were unwittingly carrying out her designs, convinced their own decisions were autonomous. The empire itself had become a living testament to her mastery, a vast psychological experiment, maintained long after she was gone. And yet, no one could trace her final movements, no body confirmed, no tomb marked. She had become a phantom, a shadow whose presence lingered in every command, every fear, every act of obedience. Legends suggest she may have fled to distant lands, living under an assumed identity while continuing to observe the empire she had molded. Others claim she remained within the palace, hidden behind false walls and secret passages, her life extending in secrecy as she watched generations rise and fall. Regardless of the truth, her disappearance ensured that the mechanisms she had established remained intact. By removing herself from the visible stage, she eliminated the possibility of succession conflicts, rebellion, or challenges to her authority, leaving the empire perpetually influenced by her unseen hand. The most chilling revelations from the restricted archives describe her manipulation of memory and perception, techniques she refined to perfection. Prisoners, courtiers, and generals who survived her reign carried fragments of her influence long after she had gone, unaware that their thoughts, decisions, and loyalties were echoes of her will. These methods, recorded in cryptic texts, highlight a ruler whose genius lay not in conquest or war alone, but in the enduring reshaping of human behavior, ensuring that fear, obedience, and control outlasted her corporeal existence. For centuries, historians overlooked these records, dismissing them as allegory or legend. Only recently, with careful decryption and analysis, has the true scale of her mastery become apparent. The Crimson Queen did not merely govern an empire, she orchestrated an enduring system of psychological dominion, one that persisted invisibly and irrevocably. Her disappearance was not an end but a continuation, a final act of control that transformed absence into power. Now, consider the implications. A ruler whose influence can survive invisibly, whose methods are so deeply embedded that entire generations obey without question, whose absence is itself a tool of governance. If you've followed the Crimson Queen's story this far, the layers of strategy, manipulation, and dominance are staggering. Make sure to leave a comment with your thoughts, perhaps something like, "This message was for me." Hit the like button if this story captivated you, and confirm you're subscribed to continue exploring histories that textbooks try to erase. And there's more. There's a video linked nearby that complements this tale perfectly. Click over and continue uncovering the dark truths of the past with me.